There's a moment in every soldier's life when the training stops and reality begins. It's the moment when everything you've learned, every drill you've executed 1,000 times, every piece of equipment you've memorized suddenly becomes the difference between life and death. But what happens when the training doesn't prepare you for the impossible? What happens when the most dangerous moment of your entire military career doesn't happen on the battlefield? It happens in the darkness of a marketplace in a forgotten corner of the world. With nothing but your mind, your discipline, and your refusal to quit? Captain Sarah Mitchell was told countless times during her service that a soldier's greatest weapon is their rifle. Sergeants drilled it into her. Officers repeated it at briefings. Every tactical manual, every combat doctrine reinforced the same message. You are only as dangerous as your firepower. But on a night in 2019, she would discover that the most powerful force on any battlefield doesn't come from ammunition or explosives or military might. It comes from courage. It comes from training your mind to stay calm when everything around you is screaming at you to panic. It comes from understanding that sometimes disarming a threat means understanding it first. As she stood there in that marketplace, hands raised, facing down a situation that had spiraled completely beyond protocol, Sarah realized something that would change not only her life, but also challenge everything the military had taught her about power, strength, and what it truly means to be armed. This is her story. But before we go any further, I want you to think about this. If you couldn't use force, couldn't use weapons, couldn't use any traditional military advantage, what would you do? How would you survive? Would your training be enough? Sarah Mitchell grew up in a small town in Colorado where the military wasn't a foregone conclusion, but a calling. Her father had been a mechanic, and her mother worked at the local library, and neither of them had served. But Sarah had always felt something different coursing through her veins, a need to be part of something bigger than herself, to stand for something that mattered. When she turned 17, she made the decision to join the Army National Guard, much to her parents' concern. Her mother worried endlessly about combat, about injury, about loss. Her father simply hugged her and told her to work hard and make them proud. The early years of her service were transformative but grueling. Sarah quickly learned that the military wasn't what movies portrayed it to be. It wasn't about heroic moments or dramatic gunfights. It was about discipline, repetition, and an almost obsessive attention to detail. She learned to clean weapons until she could do it blindfolded. She ran until her legs felt like they would collapse, and then she ran more. She mastered hand signals, communications protocols, and the tactical knowledge that came from studying hundreds of scenarios. But more importantly, she learned how to work as part of a unit, how to trust people with her life, and how to remain calm under pressure. When Sarah was commissioned as an officer after her college ROTC years, she felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders like body armor. She was no longer just responsible for herself. She was responsible for the soldiers under her command. This realization changed everything. Every decision she made, every corner she turned, every protocol she followed had to be executed perfectly because lives depended on her competence. She trained harder than ever before, not just in physical capabilities, but in leadership philosophy. She read military history voraciously, studied past operations, analyzed what worked and what failed. She began to understand that the best commanders weren't the ones with the most impressive kill records or the most aggressive tactics. They were the ones who kept their people alive and brought them home. Sarah's first deployment came when she was 24 years old. The adrenaline and fear mixed together in her chest as the transport plane descended toward the base in Afghanistan. She had trained for this moment her entire military career, but no amount of preparation could have truly readied her for the weight of reality. The heat was suffocating, the landscape barren and austere, and the constant tension of potential danger never truly left your system. She served with distinction, completing her deployment without losing anyone in her unit. But she carried the experience with her like a second skin, understanding now that the real cost of war wasn't just measured in physical injuries, but in the psychological toll of responsibility, of knowing that one mistake could have devastating consequences. After her first deployment, Sarah was reassigned to a joint operations center where she worked on coordination and intelligence analysis. While it lacked the immediate danger of field operations, the intellectual demands were equally challenging. She spent long hours studying threat assessments, learning about insurgent networks, and understanding the nuances of regional conflicts. It was during this period that she developed a peculiar skill that would later define her career. She became fascinated with understanding the psychology of conflict rather than just the mechanics of warfare. She attended advanced courses on conflict resolution, studied linguistics and cultural dynamics, and began to understand that many conflicts arose not from inherent evil, but from miscommunication, desperation, and a lack of alternative options. Her commanding officer noticed her unusual approach and began assigning her to special projects. One of these projects involved analyzing how certain groups recruited members, what drove individuals to extremism, and what factors might convince someone to abandon a dangerous path. Sarah dove into this work with characteristic intensity, building profiles, studying individual cases, and developing theories about de-escalation and negotiation. Her colleagues sometimes questioned her approach. This was the military, after all. The focus should be on neutralizing threats, not understanding them. But Sarah's metrics showed something interesting. Her approach reduced civilian casualties in her area of operations and sometimes led to intelligence breakthroughs because she understood motivations rather than just target profiles. Her work earned her a promotion to major and a position in a specialized unit focused on complex operations that required both tactical knowledge and psychological insight. By 2018, Sarah was considered one of the most unconventional thinkers in her command structure. She wasn't the kind of officer who barked orders and expected blind obedience. She was the kind who asked questions, who wanted to understand the why behind every mission, who pushed back against protocols she felt were ineffective. Some superiors appreciated this approach. Others found her frustratingly independent. Sarah didn't care much what people thought of her methods as long as they produced results. And they did. When she was selected for the mission that would change everything, she had no idea that her years of unconventional thinking would be tested in a way she never anticipated. The briefing came down from higher command with unusual secrecy. A high-value intelligence asset was being extracted from a city in Southeast Asia, and her unit would provide security for the operation. The details were compartmentalized, which made Sarah uneasy. She preferred to know everything about a mission, to understand all the moving pieces so she could anticipate problems. But this was beyond her control, so she prepared her team as thoroughly as she could with the limited information available. The operation began like most did: careful planning, equipment checks, contingency scenarios mapped out to the smallest detail. Sarah's team consisted of 12 soldiers, all highly trained, all professionals who had proven themselves in previous operations. They arrived in the city at dusk, moving through the crowded streets with purpose but without drawing attention. The extraction point was a marketplace in the Old City district. A maze of narrow alleys and crowded shops where a single Western soldier would stand out, but a carefully dispersed unit could blend into the chaos. The intelligence asset turned out to be a woman named Amira, a former government official who had gathered evidence of corruption at the highest levels. She was terrified, hunted by multiple factions who wanted either to silence her or use her for leverage. Sarah's job was to get her out safely. The team moved through the market with practiced efficiency, using radio communications and visual signals to coordinate their positions. Sarah kept her weapon at low ready, scanning the crowd constantly for threats. The marketplace was packed with evening shoppers, families, vendors packing up their stalls. Children played between the shops. The air was thick with the smell of spices and humanity. Everything seemed normal until it wasn't. The explosion came without warning, not a gunshot, not a command to disperse. Just the sudden, apocalyptic sound of an IED detonating in the crowd. People screamed. Bodies fell. Smoke and dust filled the air. Sarah's training kicked in immediately. She checked her team through the radio, accounting for each soldier. 3 were down, 2 severely injured. The marketplace had descended into chaos as civilians fled in all directions. Then she saw it. A second device, rigged to go off in the middle of a cluster of wounded people and fleeing civilians. Dozens would die in seconds. Without thinking, she moved toward the device. Her sergeant grabbed her arm, asking what she was doing. She told him to secure the asset and fall back. He refused. She gave him a direct order. He obeyed, but she could see the protest in his eyes as she handed him her rifle and moved into the smoke. She had less than 90 seconds before the second device detonated. Sarah had extensive training in explosives, but this device was sophisticated, wired in a way that suggested technical knowledge. Her hands moved with precision despite her racing heart. She carefully exposed the circuitry, studying the mechanism by the light of her tactical flashlight. A deadman switch. The moment she touched it incorrectly, the whole thing would trigger. She thought of her father working on engines with the same careful precision she was now using on this bomb. She thought of the civilians around her. She thought of her team, and she stopped thinking about herself entirely. The deadman switch was more complex than any training scenario had prepared her for, but its basic principle remained the same. It required constant pressure on a lever to prevent detonation. Sarah realized quickly that she couldn't remove the device without triggering it. She couldn't bypass the circuit. She couldn't fight her way out of this situation with training or strength or willpower. She had to slow down and think. Her mind became laser-focused, shutting out the chaos around her, the screams, the smoke, the danger. She examined the entire circuit, tracing wires with her fingers, understanding the logic of the bomber's construction. They had made one mistake, a small one, almost negligible, but a mistake nonetheless. The secondary circuit had redundancy, but the primary trigger mechanism relied on a specific pressure level on the lever. If she could gradually shift the weight distribution without releasing pressure, she might be able to transfer the detonation trigger to a circuit that would fail in a specific sequence rather than an immediate explosion. It was a theory. It was dangerous. It might not work at all, but it was the only option she had. Sarah spent the next 4 minutes working with microscopic precision while people moved around her, while emergency sirens wailed in the distance. While every instinct in her body screamed at her to run, she used a piece of twisted metal from the blast radius to carefully redistribute the pressure on the lever, using gravity and angles to create a slow transference of weight. The principle was sound, but execution was nearly impossible. Her hands were steady, but sweat dripped into her eyes. Her breathing was controlled, but her heart was exploding in her chest. She couldn't afford a single mistake. A group of civilians was huddled 30 meters away, unable to flee because their elderly father had been injured. A mother was cradling her child, trying to shield her from the horror unfolding. These people had nothing to do with this conflict, with intelligence operations, with military strategy. They were simply human beings who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Sarah's voice was completely calm as she worked, her training in explosive disposal finally reaching its full potential. She made contact with the primary circuit, a tiny gold connection point that she had to keep at exactly the right angle while she worked the secondary lever. Her fingers moved in millimeter increments, each movement calculated and precise. Time seemed to stretch. She wasn't thinking about protocols or procedures anymore. She was thinking about the craft itself, about understanding the mind of the person who had built this device, about anticipating every possible outcome. The device finally reached a state where the detonation sequence was distributed across a non-critical pathway. She was still holding the lever with exactly the right amount of pressure, but now the device had been essentially neutralized. The moment of release came quietly, without fanfare. She carefully, infinitesimally slowly, reduced the pressure on the lever while simultaneously ensuring the secondary circuit remained stable. The timer on the device stopped. The red digits froze. And Sarah Mitchell, who had been told her entire career that a soldier's greatest weapon was their rifle, had stopped an explosion with nothing but her mind. The aftermath of that night felt strange in its ordinariness. Medical teams arrived. The wounded were evacuated. The intelligence asset was secured and extracted successfully. Sarah's soldiers recovered. The mission was declared a success. But the official reports were strangely sparse about what had actually happened. The explosion, the second device, the reason it hadn't detonated, all of it was compartmentalized into classified sections that most people would never see. Sarah underwent a full medical evaluation to ensure she hadn't been injured by the blast or psychologically compromised by the experience. She submitted her after-action report, detailing every moment of the incident with brutal honesty, including her decision to disobey direct orders to secure the asset because civilian lives were in immediate danger. She knew this decision could have ended her career. Military protocol exists for a reason, and breaking it, even for the right reasons, can have serious consequences. Instead, something unexpected happened. A call came from the Pentagon, then another call from the State Department. Suddenly, Sarah was being interviewed by people in positions she didn't fully understand, asking her detailed questions about her methods, her decision-making process, and her understanding of the device she had neutralized. They wanted to know how she had remained calm, how she had approached an unfamiliar problem under extreme pressure, how she had prioritized civilian lives over mission objectives. Sarah answered their questions honestly. She explained that she hadn't been thinking about the bigger picture or protocol. She had been thinking about the people around her and the responsibility she had to protect them. She had been thinking about the fact that military power doesn't exist in a vacuum. It has to be tempered with humanity and judgment. The interviews lasted weeks. During this time, Sarah was kept away from her unit, placed in an administrative capacity, her security clearance temporarily elevated to an unprecedented level. She felt disconnected from her identity as a soldier, stripped of her unit identity, and placed in bureaucratic limbo. Then, one afternoon, a decorated general called her into a secure conference room and told her that her actions had attracted the attention of command-level strategists who were rethinking how the military approached complex operations. They were creating a new division focused on de-escalation, threat assessment, and non-kinetic solutions to complex security problems. They wanted Sarah to lead it. She would still maintain her rank as major, but her role would expand far beyond traditional military operations. She would advise command, train other soldiers in psychological tactics and threat analysis, and represent a new approach to how the military could solve problems beyond conventional warfare. It was an extraordinary opportunity, but it came with a weight Sarah hadn't anticipated. She was being asked to fundamentally reconsider what her career meant and what her purpose would be in the military moving forward. Sarah accepted the position, though not without reservation. She understood that accepting this role meant she would be challenging the fundamental culture of military operations. There would be resistance. There would be commanders who believed that her philosophy was soft, that it would get soldiers killed, that the military needed warriors who could fight, not psychologists who wanted to talk. She prepared for this resistance because she had experienced it before, but now she had the authority and the mandate to push back against it. Her new unit started small, 12 officers and enlisted personnel who shared her unconventional approach to security challenges. She established a training program that combined tactical knowledge with psychological study, that taught soldiers not just how to clear rooms, but how to understand the people inside those rooms and why they might pose a threat. She taught her soldiers that asking questions wasn't a sign of weakness or uncertainty. It was a sign of intelligence and tactical awareness. They learned to recognize patterns of recruitment, signs of desperation, and potential opening points for de-escalation. The program was rigorous and demanding in different ways than traditional combat training. Instead of running until exhaustion, her soldiers studied case files. Instead of endless rifle drills, they engaged in mock negotiations and complex problem-solving scenarios. They learned to think critically about their orders, to understand the strategic context behind their missions, and to consider the long-term consequences of their actions. Word about the program spread through military circles, and responses were mixed. Some forward-thinking commanders saw the value immediately and started sending their best personnel for training. Others dismissed it as a waste of time and resources. Sarah didn't waste energy trying to convince the skeptics. She focused on proving the value of her approach through results. Operations led by commanders who had been through her program showed lower civilian casualty rates, higher intelligence collection rates, and better long-term outcomes in terms of stability and security. Within 2 years, the program expanded. Within 5 years, elements of her philosophy had been incorporated into official military doctrine. Sarah was invited to speak at war colleges and military academies. She published papers on conflict de-escalation and psychological threat assessment. She became a mentor to younger officers who wanted to approach their careers with the same kind of thoughtful, strategic mindset she embodied. But she never forgot that night in the marketplace, never forgot the weight of the dead man's switch under her fingers, never forgot that true strength sometimes requires laying down your weapon and picking up something far more powerful, your mind, your judgment, and your commitment to protecting human life above all else. Major Sarah Mitchell's journey from a small-town girl with military ambitions to a revolutionary force within military strategy represents something that transcends traditional military storytelling. Her story isn't about the firepower she commanded or the number of threats she eliminated. It's about discovering that the most dangerous weapon on any battlefield is an armed mind guided by principles and compassion. What happened that night in the marketplace when she stopped a bomb without firing a single shot fundamentally changed not just her life, but rippled through military institutions, challenging decades of doctrine and forcing a reckoning with what it truly means to be a soldier. Her courage wasn't displayed through violent confrontation, but through the quiet bravery of remaining calm under impossible pressure, of trusting her training in unexpected ways, and of choosing civilian lives over mission protocol. That choice, that decision to prioritize human life, became the foundation for everything she built afterward. The new division she established, the training program she created, the officers she mentored, all of it stemmed from that single moment of clarity in the smoke and chaos of the marketplace. Sarah's legacy teaches us that military strength isn't measured solely in kinetic capability. It's measured in discipline, in wisdom, in the ability to remain human in dehumanizing situations, and in the courage to challenge existing systems when you believe a better way exists. She proved that a soldier can be thoughtful, introspective, and strategically intelligent while still being effective and powerful. She demonstrated that understanding your adversary, understanding the context of conflict, and seeking nonviolent solutions when possible doesn't make you weak, it makes you extraordinary. Today, as military organizations worldwide continue to evolve and face increasingly complex threats that can't be solved through conventional warfare, Sarah's message becomes more relevant than ever. True strength lies not in what you can destroy, but in what you can understand, influence, and ultimately preserve. The soldiers who serve today, who use de-escalation training developed partly through Sarah's pioneering work, continue her legacy every single day. They carry forward the message that you don't need to be armed with weapons to be dangerous, to be powerful, and to save lives. Sarah Mitchell's story reminds us all that the greatest victories aren't always the loudest ones, and the most powerful warriors aren't always the ones with the biggest guns. Sometimes, they're the ones brave enough to think differently, strong enough to remain calm in chaos, and wise enough to know that peace, when possible, is always the better choice.